Hello, everybody. This is Jim Ransom with another session of Morning Jim Poetry. Here we are. It's already November 28th, and I missed sending out the program this past weekend due to illness and not a little jet lag after arriving home from a long flight from Heathrow in London. I'm sorry, but I'm sure you had plenty of Thanksgiving dinner leftovers, as well as Black Friday shopping, and maybe interacting with relatives you've only seen 5 years ago the last time. I don't know. But anyway, I'm sure you kept plenty busy without my interference. I was in Banchory, Scotland on Armistice Day, which is what we used to call Veterans Day. And what we call World War I, in the UK it's called the Great War, and the celebration of it is called Remembrance Day. It is a war, or was a war, that cost the Western Allies, which were mainly Britain, France, and Italy for a period of time, and America. It cost the Western Allies 5 million men killed, and the Germans lost at least 3.5 to 4 million. We're not sure of the number exactly. It was a war that should never have occurred, but it excited a huge outpouring of war poetry, and it also signaled really pretty much the end of the Romantic era in poetry that lasted most of the 19th century. And while in Banchory, Scotland, I attended the Remembrance Day ceremony where kilted Highland Regiment veterans and their bagpipers did a slow march to a tall stone memorial in the town square. And all over the UK, there were similar ceremonies going on at that time. And on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, regardless of whether you are shopping or at home or working, everything stops with silence for 2 minutes. It is and has remained for many years a big deal. After all, unlike us, the British, for example, lost almost an entire generation of men. And there was a long time when young women it was very difficult for them to find a mate, even if they wanted to get married. Poetry was also a big deal in those days. The London Times received, if you can believe this, at least 1,000 poems every day in the mail, both from soldiers at the front and from civilians. The newspapers of the time were full of war poems. There wasn't much in the way of movies or there wasn't any TV, of course. And so poetry had a bigger place to play in telling the story and the emotions of the times than it ever has had since then. I recently read a book, if I can find it here, called The Great War by Paul Fussell. Some of you have probably read this book because it was published in the 1970s, I think, It was the winner of the National Book Award and the National Critics Circle Award back around 1976. And it is a dramatically effective story of how the First World War affected civilization. And since Fussell is a literary man, a literary professor himself, it's got a lot of poetry things in it. There were poets in that war that have never lost favor and have become well known. I'm only going to present two of them today because there were so many. And then after I read that book I just showed you, and after I think this came after I got home, I got a book called International Poetry of the First World War by Constance who I know and who sent me this book. And I also attended one of her lectures about this subject before I left for my vacation in Scotland and in England. I won't tell you about that, although we had some fun. We almost got rained out of Scotland. It was wet, the wettest I've ever seen it, and I've been there 21 different times. Okay. But Constance Rusick's book, she is a professor of English at Robert Morris University near here. The book was published by Bloomsbury, and it is a wonderful book because what she's done is she's researched a lot of the poems that got published maybe just once or didn't get into books and never made their writers famous. And they were not the star poets of the war like Wilford Owen and Siegfried Sassoon and several others. Wilford Owen, a very handsome British officer, was killed nearly at the end of the war. Sassoon survived and had a successful literary career thereafter. But let's get into some poetry here. Here's a poem by Siegfried Sassoon. It's entitled Dreamers. Soldiers are citizens of death's gray land, drawing no dividend from time's tomorrows. In the great hour of destiny they stand, each with his feuds and jealousies and sorrows. Soldiers are sworn to action. They must win some flaming, fatal climax with their lives. Soldiers are dreamers. When the guns begin, they think of firelit homes, clean beds, and wives. I see them in foul dugouts, gnawed by rats, and in the ruined trenches lashed with rain, dreaming of things they did with balls and bats, and mocked by hopeless longing to regain bank holidays and picture shows and spats, and going to the office in the train. This is kind of typical of the ironic poetry that was written at that time, but let's read another one by Wilford Owen. Owen was published a lot during the war, but he was killed fighting the Germans nearly at the end of the war. Probably he was killed maybe the last week of the war before the armistice. It was really a tragic and ironic way to go. Sassoon incidentally survived and went on afterwards. Here's the Wilford Owen poem. It's called Anthem for Doomed Youth. When passing bells, what passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning, save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all, not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. That poem, as you may have been able to tell, is a sonnet, and the use of that form itself is highly ironic, as it was a favorite form of love poems prior to that time. The final couplet of the 14 lines of this poem is searingly sad. I'll read it again. Their flowers, the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk, a drawing down of blinds. Yeah, searingly sad ending to the poem. Now we're going to turn to a poem written by an American woman before the American entry into the war. Remember that America became the arsenal of democracy, so-called, selling arms to all of the Allies, not the Germans, whose submarines, not nearly as deadly as those in the Second World War, but those submarines in the First World War were sinking a lot of shipments of supplies to Great Britain and France. So, here's a poem that was written by an American woman who did not make much of a name for herself as a poet, but she was a pretty good poet, and she certainly was a social critic. This is called the Ballad of Bethlehem Steel, or The Need for Preparedness, a tale of the ticker for the public. A fort is taken, the papers say. 5,000 dead in the murderous deal. A victory? No, just another grim day. But up to 500 goes to Bethlehem Steel. A whisper, a rumor, one knows not where. A sigh, a prayer from a torn heart rent, a murmur of peace on the death-laden air, but Bethlehem Steel drops 30%. We'll fight to the death, the diplomats cry. We'll fight to the death, sigh the weary men, as the battle roars to shuddering sky. And Bethlehem Steel has a rise of 10. What matters the loss of 1,000,000 men? What matters the waste of blossoming lands? The children's cry or the women's pain if Bethlehem Steel had 600 stands. And so we must join in the slaughter mill. We must arm ourselves for a senseless hate. We must waste our youths in the murder drill, that Bethlehem Steel may hold its state. Now that poem is very critical of the American industry as represented by Bethlehem Steel for getting us involved in the war. That's what the theory behind this poem by Grace Isabel Colburn happened to be. Grace Isabel Colburn was a what we would call a left-wing activist in today's world. From 1914 to 1918, according to Rusick's book, the Allied and Central Powers, that means the Allies and their German enemies, and the other side of the enemy list was the Austro-Hungarian Empire that had grown out of what originally was the Holy Roman Empire. But they had poured over 4 years, $208 billion waging war. Adjusted for inflation, the amount today would exceed $3.5 trillion. So that's a lot of money. It was really more then than it is now. And it pretty well impoverished France and Britain and Germany for a while. Before the United States entered the war, many Americans wanted nothing to do with the conflict, but of course many others did. They saw Germany as a potential future threat. They were right about that. But many Americans wanted to remain neutral. And there were also those who didn't think the war was a bad thing for them. They owned stock in a lot of companies that were getting rich on the war, such as Bethlehem Steel. And celebrating those profits in May of 1916, Charles Schwab, president of Bethlehem Steel, and his descendants are still around, aren't they? The Schwab investment interests. But Charles Schwab addressed the executives of the American Iron and Steel Institute, and he had this to say: "Boys, we are in a period of great prosperity. I wonder if any of us ever expected or dreamed that we should ever see any such state of affairs as we see today. May this prosperity continue." Well, Bethlehem Steel was serving up military contracts with Russia, Britain, and France, and the United States, of course. It was the leading U.S. supplier of Allied ships, munitions, and ordnance. So it did everything. The orders on hand at Bethlehem Steel in 1917, shortly before America got into the war, were 20 times as great as they were in 1913. So the war made profits, but it also made many losses. And as I said earlier, it was a completely unnecessary war. it started sort of automatically when countries began to respond to the pleas of old treaties that they had, which were really not reflective of the state of affairs at the time the war started. But away they went, thinking that the war might last 6 months or a year at the most. And how wrong they were. Okay. After it dawned on the publics of both America and Europe that this was a war that no one could win, the Allies finally won it. But the main winner of the war for them was not a specific battle with the Butch, which is what they called the Germans. The real cause of the victory was the starvation of Germany and the German soldiers caused by the Allied blockade. And then the war came to a sudden end when the Germans just stopped fighting. The Kaiser fled Germany to Holland, which was a neutral country at the time. And then the Allies imposed a very strict post-war regimen on Germany of reparations and took away some of its lands and made it promise it would never involve itself in war again. But all that caused was resentment. And of course, it led to the rise of Hitler. And only about 30 years later, bingo, we were on the verge of a Second World War. Okay, I'd like to read some more poems by the poets of World War I, and I'm going to do that next week. So tune in again then, and I'm going to try to stay on schedule. Thanks for watching, and we'll have poetry on Morning Gym Poetry on a regular weekly basis from now on. Bye now.